We've previously talked about the fact that a big part of domain-driven design is about taking large domains and breaking them into smaller pieces. So in this section, we're going to talk about how we do that to some extent. We're going to discuss some of the techniques and some of the ideas that we'll use in order to break up our domain into smaller pieces. So the first thing to realize is, of course, that business domains are often large and complicated. It's pretty rare that we find a business domain that is really tight and easy to understand without breaking it down any further. In fact, I often like to take experiments where I will go in and look at a particular domain and start trying to model it. And in doing so, I'll often try to pick a very simple domain to kind of say, okay, let's find something really simple that I can dig into in a lot of detail. And what very quickly happens when I do this is I realize that those things that initially seemed simple are not nearly as simple as I thought. There's actually a lot of complexity in there. So this is what happens with any business domain. There's a lot of complexity in there. They contain ideas, actions, rules that interact in very complex ways. And therefore, trying to model that as a single domain can become problematic. So if we look at our restaurant domain, you might initially think, restaurant's pretty simple. You got servers, you got cooks, you got, these different people in the restaurant. That's not that hard. But when you actually start digging into it, you realize there's a lot of objects that are involved here. You've got menus, you've got orders, cooks, servers, reservations, you've got dishwashers, drinks, plates, tips, bills, cash, credit, debit, delivery. And this goes on and on and on. That's not even talking about things like inventory management or any of these other complexities, your payroll, all of those types of things. So obviously this can get really big really fast. And so if we were to try to model this all as one domain, it would get pretty muddled. So what we do in domain-driven design is we take our large domains and we separate them into subdomains. So our subdomains are created by grouping related ideas and actions and rules into a separate subdomain. So if we look at our restaurant again, we had all those different ideas, but some of them are related. So for example, we can look at reservation, table, customer, time, location. Those are all specifically related to creating a reservation. So we might look at that and say, well, perhaps there's a reservations subdomain that deals just with creating reservations within our restaurant. And we can kind of extract that out into a separate set of terms and a separate ubiquitous language. In fact, we can extract it out into a separate model. What we may realize, though, is that some parts of that may exist in multiple subdomains. Customer, for example, is probably going to exist in other subdomains as well. It's not strictly limited to reservations. So we have to recognize the fact that some of these concepts can actually cross multiple subdomains. Now, it's also important to realize that those shared concepts, such as customer, may not be identical initially, so they may actually look different. They also may look initially the same, but then evolve differently over time. Because of that, it's important to avoid the temptation to abstract. We may have a temptation to take the concept of customer and say that, well, we just have one concept of customer and it always looks the same, no matter what subdomain we're working in. But the reality is customer in, say, the reservation subdomain may have details that are unimportant in other parts of the business. Or it may not need details that are important in other parts of the business. Because of that, each subdomain essentially ends up having its own ubiquitous language and model. So the language and model for a subdomain is what we call a bounded context. And that's, if you look in our little red box here, the language includes words like reservation, table, customer, time, location, etc. If you look at the model of these things, well, a customer, for example, in the reservations context is going to include certain details. We probably need to know their phone number so that if there's a problem with their reservation, we can contact them. We may not need to know their address. That's not particularly important for reservations. Might be important in other parts of the business. Deliveries, for example, would need that information. But reservations, it doesn't really matter. And so as a result, we can say that the model of a customer in reservations is probably not the same as a model of a customer in other parts of the business. So this is your bounded context. It's the combination of the model and ubiquitous language. And Subdomains or bounded contexts usually map in kind of a one-to-one relationship. So you'll often see those terms used interchangeably. The most common term you'll see is bounded context. But these are a good starting point for building reactive microservices. When we want to build a microservice, it's often a good idea to start looking at our bounded contexts. That may not be where we stop. We may take an individual bounded context and break it up into multiple microservices. But at the very least, we probably don't want to have all of our bounded contexts combined into a single service, because that's building a monolith. So that's a key element that we can look at. And we'll talk about ways that you can break these bounded contexts up later. But for now, let's just think about how we can build microservices around a bounded context. So let's try to understand those bounded contexts a little bit better. So from one bounded context to the next, the meaning of a word may change dramatically. So in our restaurant, for example, we're talking to a server. The term order has a very specific meaning. When you talk to the server, it means one thing. However, if you talk to somebody else in the restaurant, for example, the person who manages inventory, then order means something different. When you're talking to a server, an order is something that is very much client-facing. The customer comes in, they place an order, and the restaurant provides them with food. In that case, the customer they represent the customer, whereas the restaurant represents the supplier for that order. Now, if you flip it around and talk about inventory management, the roles actually change up completely. Now the restaurant is the customer. And there is some external supplier who is supplying supplying the inventory supplies. So it takes on a very different meaning depending on who you talk to in the restaurant. It's still an order, and it may share some similarity with the orders, with the other order, but it's important to understand that they are not the same order. You can't model them the same, because within the context of the restaurant, they mean very different things. We also have to observe how the details of the model change. So in a restaurant, when a kitchen is preparing an order, there's certain things they care about. They need to know what's on the order. They need to know, did the person order the reactive ribs? Did they order the steak? What did they order? So those types of details are important. They need to know anything about special instructions. Did they want that steak medium rare? That's important. There's other things they don't care about. They don't care about the price. It makes no difference to the kitchen what the price is. That matters to the customer, obviously, and it matters to the server or whoever's collecting the money. But from the kitchen's perspective, it's irrelevant. So that's an area of detail where we don't need to provide the kitchen with all of that extra information that they don't need. And there's probably going to be other things too. It's not just going to be price. There'll be other things as well. And so it's important to understand that those details change depending on what part of the business you're working in. So how do we determine bounded contexts? How do we decide what is a bounded context and what isn't? Where do we decide to draw those boundaries? So there's no universal answer. I can't just say, well, always do this and you'll get the right answer every time. There's nothing that works like that. But there are some guidelines. We want to consider human culture and interaction. So if you look at our restaurant, there's different areas of the restaurant that are handled by different groups of people. That starts to suggest a natural division. If different people are doing different jobs, that suggests a natural division, and it might imply a separate bounded context. Look for changes in the ubiquitous language. So if the language or meaning of that language changes, it may suggest a new context. Again, when we're talking about order, there's the order that the server takes and there's the order that is used for inventory management. Those two orders are different, therefore they may exist in a different bounded context. Look for varying or unnecessary information. So employee ID is very important in an employee, but it's meaningless in a customer. So that again might imply that those pieces of information belong in different bounded contexts. Another thing to realize is that strongly separated bounded contexts will usually result in smooth workflows. If you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to implement a particular workflow and it's awkward, that may suggest that you've misunderstood your domain or you've broken up your bounded context incorrectly. If you find a bounded context has too many dependencies, again, it may be overcomplicated. You may have drawn your lines incorrectly, so that's an area where you want to explore in a little more detail and try and figure out if you've done something wrong. Traditionally, domain-driven design focused on the objects within the domain. So if you go back to Eric Evans' book, you'll see he focused a lot on those objects, the cook, the reservation, the customer, things like that. In more recent times, the techniques have evolved a little bit, and now we talk a lot about event-first domain-driven design, which places the focus on the activities or events that occur in the domain. So rather than looking at those objects, we look at what is happening to those objects or what they are doing. So customer makes a reservation. That's an event or an activity. Server places an order is an activity or an event. Food is served to the customer. These are all activities or events that occur in our domain. Using event-first domain-driven design, we look to define the activities first, then we group those activities to find logical system boundaries. There is a particular technique called event storming. We're not going to go into detail on event storming here. There's a great book on it, though, if you're interested in more detail about event storming. And there's also other courses offered on how to do event storming. We're going to take a technique in the exercises that we're going to call it sort of a light version of event storming. It's going to be very guided, very on the rails. It will use some of the same techniques, but it's going to be very much simplified just so that we can fit it into the context of this course. If we tried to teach event storming and use event storming, this course would be far too long. So we're just going to take a very, very, very simplified approach in the exercises in this course.